Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to welcome you here to the first Directors Forum of this school year. I'm Geneva Overholser. I'm director of the Annenberg School of Journalism. And most every Tuesday, I should tell you that this year there are going to be a few exceptions because we're going to have a few teaching discussions among our faculty. So please do watch the web postings and make sure that we are actually having a Directors Forum. But almost every Tuesday at noon, here in 207, for those of you who are just joining Annenberg this year, we gather and talk about journalism, all different aspects of journalism, and we are joined by interesting guests. And today's guests are really most welcome. We're very glad that they agreed to join us. A couple of weeks ago, Richard Reeves, here, the esteemed, one of our faculty members, wrote me and he said, you ought to get the Bell team to come in here. Of course, I knew right away, as you all do, what he meant. This group of LA Times journalists have given us a story that is one of the classics of watchdog reporting, the very kind of thing that we all know that traditional media institutions have been so indispensable in giving us. And as I understand it, although they'll correct me if I'm wrong, it grew up out of beat reporting, good old standard beat reporting. And it documents a case of abuse of public funds that is breathtaking. But it's just been a classic news story, and I'm extremely glad that they're here to talk to us about it today. So I'm going to turn the meeting over to Shelby Grad, who is city editor at the LA Times, and take it away. Great to have you.
Thanks. As Geneva said, this story came out of beat reporting. We all have sat through city council meetings. I was a young reporter. I spent years for the Times covering these little cities in Orange County, hoping that one day some huge piece of news would break in it. It never happened for me. But it did happen for Ruben and Jeff. This story literally started a night Ruben went to a Maywood City Council meeting, and really the genesis of this story and everything that moved forward from it emanates from this one meeting, Ruben and Jeff teaming up together to understand what was going on in these two cities. And maybe you guys could just take it away about how this all came together.
Okay, well, let's start with the city of Maywood, which is next door to Bell. The city of Maywood, what happened is they decided they were having problems. They couldn't get insurance because their police department was so screwed up, everyone was suing them, so the city as a whole couldn't get insurance. So what they decided to do was to disband not only the police department, but lay off all city employees, almost all of them. And that was Ruben's story. And so Ruben's working on that, and then these guys called me up and they asked me to help on the story. And what I actually generally covered before this, although I periodically get pulled into other stuff, other investigative stuff, I was covering the South Bay, which was anywhere from basically LA Airport through San Pedro and whatever else I could get my hands on. So Ruben and I were talking about a little bit about Maywood.
Well, as Jeff touched on the issue of the employees being laid off, we wrote a story about that. And I think we were looking into to see whether there were any investigations going on in Maywood that perhaps we didn't touch on. And so I think Jeff called the district attorney's office and we started inquiring about Maywood. But it turns out that there was a connection with next door city of Bell, who was going to offer all the city services for Maywood.
Right. The sheriffs was taking over the policing in Maywood. Bell is taking over city services. So we write this story about Bell laying everyone off. Maywood, I'm sorry, Maywood. The next day, I find out that the DA is investigating Bell for these $100,000 salaries the city council people make. We didn't know anything about $100,000 salaries, let alone an investigation. So we then wrote that story. That then, to use a pun, which I hate to do, rang a bell in my head. And what it reminded me of a story I had done when I worked at the San Jose Mercury News, which way back then was a very good newspaper. And what that story was about I did a big project on the East Palo Alto Sanitary District. Now, East Palo Alto is not Palo Alto. It's a poor city. It's literally across the railroad tracks. It's another county. And what this story was about, how the sanitary district, which is just the sewers, they had built this Taj Mahal building. The board members were spending monies on traveling across the country, staying in fancy hotels, eating fancy meals, and spending all kinds of money. And I wrote a story on that, a long, big project, and ended up a couple people were charged. That's what this reminded me of. So, and I figured what was going to happen is we would find over people spending money that they shouldn't have, the government money. So Ruben and I then the next day, we go down to Bell City Hall. And basically we want to see minutes of meetings, we want to see expenses of city council people, expenses of the city manager. And we've been hearing a little bit of talk about maybe the city manager was getting paid a lot of money. We're hearing what, 300, 400 grand, something like that. So we walk in, the first thing we do, we're together, it's a small city, go to the counter, we say, can we speak to the city manager? He won't come out. Ding, 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 okay? Then the city clerk says, what are you looking for? And we say, here's what we'd like. How difficult is it to get us the damn minutes? You go back and hand us the binder. So she makes us then fill out a form, for a public records request form. So we fill it out, we figure, okay, she's going to go back and give us this stuff. And then she says, okay, it'll be 10 days. Huh?
And by the way, when was that?
When was
Roughly.
it? June? Mid-June, maybe?
We got the minutes, 5 years of minutes, yesterday.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then, she says that, you have to wait 10 days, which has to do with something in the California Public Records Act. And for all you aspiring journalists, whenever you go, they ask, you go somewhere and you say, give me this, and they say you can't have it, they have to tell you why. You say to them, under what provision of the Public Records Act do you not give it to me? They have to tell you that. Okay, but so we filled out a form, it's 10 days, then I asked for a Xerox copy of it, they charged me $1 for a Xerox copy. Okay, ding, 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 more is going on. So Ruben and I now are talking, various people in the city, we're kind of talking to people. Every day, one of us, usually me, is calling up the city clerk saying, are we going to get this stuff, today? Sometimes she'd be there, sometimes she'd return calls, and usually we know I have other stuff, and I'd always say, okay, well, we don't want to have to sue, but we will, and then we'll turn around and ask the judge to charge you guys our legal fees, because that's what the law says. So finally, on day 9, I get a phone call from the city clerk, and she says, Mr. Rizzo, the city manager, would like to meet with us. And they will give us the documents, and he'd like to talk to us about the documents. And he says, we'll meet you at this park, Little Bear Park.
It's not just a regular park. This is a park for kids under the age of 12. And they chose this conference room where the Boy Scouts meet. So it was such a strange location to be for a business meeting like this. And we walk in, and lo and behold, we see...
Yeah, there's the city manager, the assistant city manager, the police chief, 2 city council members, a city council member from Maywood, the assistant to the city administrative officer, 2 lawyers, right?
I guess it's safe enough to say we had all our eggs in one basket. Perfect for us. Right. They had all these green binders stacked up, and there were documents. The city clerk had them next to her, and these were the documents that we had requested. And I think we just...
Well, what they expected us to do was start looking through the documents and asking questions. I'm not going to do that. I got the documents, so what do I need to look at them right there? I'm going to, So we just sort of literally ignored these documents. And we started asking questions. And then I asked Rizzo, so how much money do you make? And like I said, we'd heard 300, 400 grand. And Rizzo, so now, the way we're sitting is I was sitting here, Ruben's sitting here, and then the city attorney is sitting a little bit back over there where Geneva is. So I say, how much money do you make? And Rizzo kind of coughs out, $700,000. And I didn't quite think I heard him correctly. I thought maybe he was saying $7,000 a week or a month, I don't know. And I go, excuse me. And he says, $700,000. And Ruben goes, Jesus Christ.
That was my first reaction when he popped out. And I'm writing 700 and saying Jesus Christ simultaneously at the same time. And then I hear Jeff saying, I'm sorry, how much? And I look at him and do not hear the 700,000 that I heard both ears. And then he says it again, 700,000, and I just shake my head because I'm thinking, oh great, I just gave away the story. But he says, oh, it's 700,000. He says, oh, I thought you said 7,000. So then we just, after that, we just kept each one.
Right. And then we asked the police chief, how much do you make? He says $457. And he had been in Glendale and had retired, and a week later took the Bell job. And I said to him, how much did you make in Glendale? He says $250. Then we turn to the assistant city manager and say, how much do you make? And she says, I don't know. Please. And Rizzo says, she makes about $350.
Well, it turns out, though, that his salary was actually much closer to $800.
Right, and I can tell
the
you
reason
more
why they don't know is, in fact, his compensation was closer to $1.5 million.
Right, total
because they were
compensation.
just getting all sorts of extra deals on the side. So.
Right, and then I had said to Rizzo, you're probably the highest paid city manager in LA County. And he says, I'm sure I am. And that was part of the dynamic in this meeting. They were utterly unrepentant. They were immediately, oh yeah, you get what you pay for. I could do this in, I could make this much in private sector. And I sort of had to stick my hand in my mouth to say, well, go ahead.
Well, do you think that they held that meeting in that conference room because they wanted you to see the park? Because this has been like one of their huge things, is like, we have nice parks, we're great.
Right. That's a good question. Probably. Although I had done a story about the parks. I don't know if you remember, Shelby. I've gone out and saw all the parks and wrote about how they had these wonderful, nice parks for the community. And they were using that as a justification for the salaries. That we asked them, how do you justify making 700,000, 457? How do you justify these salaries? And they were saying, well, look at our city, look at our parks, And Rizzo at one point said, I came here when the city was at brink of getting into bankruptcy. I pulled the city out of that. I brought the city positive cash flow. And the rest of the council members were sort of backing that up. Oh yeah, you fixed our lighting in the streets, it's much better. But still, nowhere did, I think, we were telepathically speaking, because I think we just said to each other, there's no way you can still justify fixing all this stuff and still make that much money. It just, to me, was bad.
To this day, months, more than a month after that story, he has continued to justify himself. We ran a profile on Sunday in which he claimed that he had been raped by newspaper.
That was a quote.
Yeah.
That was a quote.
He'd been raped by us, and that, over time, it all worked out to about $250,000 a year. And in fact, in the first days after that story ran, even though it caused a huge uproar, the mayor put out a statement, which they've since taken down from their website. But the mayor put out a statement, and what did it say?
They defended this. They were continuing to defend this guy. And you'd read it. This was after the huge uproar. You'd read it and go, my God, I'm going to go back to the meeting for a second. That meeting lasted, what, 4 hours? We think of the legal fees just from the two attorneys. But it goes to a couple $1,000s. And one of the questions I asked there was, why are you having these attorneys there? And they really couldn't quite give us a good answer. I mean, it's clear that they had no idea what was going to happen when the story came out.
We really didn't either.
No, we did. And in fact, it was funny because our meeting, Ruben and I walk out of the meeting and we say, okay, highest paid in LA County.
I said more than the president, right?
Right. And then we said, probably state of California. And, you know, it's hard to think of what public official in the United States would pay this money. And that was a Friday. And then, was it Saturday? Yeah, Saturday the next day. Ruben was working that day as a reporter. I was working as an editor that day. And I was the night editor. Kimi was the morning editor. And by the time I walk in, Ruben had told Kimi. You know, I walk in, she's like, 800,000, 700, because we hadn't done all the figuring out. But Kimi was like, $700,000.
Yeah, because it's like, for a reporter or an editor, I was talking to Ruben, we were actually walking to lunch, and I was like, what? You guys got to do this story now. I was like immediately like taken aback, because it's sort of like Christmas Day when you get it like that as a reporter or editor.
And then in fact that figure, when we looked at the contract, and it's not like you look at the contract and it says, Bob Rizzo makes, you know, it doesn't say $787,000. That's not what it is. You have to be able to do about 4th grade math to figure this stuff out. It started out literally with his first contract, right, in 1993. And from then on, and there were a couple other contracts, and then it was addendum. And each addendum would say something like.
And that was one of the great things about the story was that in the past, many people had asked Rizzo how much he made, and they became these much lower answers. They'd be giving them little sort of subsets of what his total salary was. And so it took you about a month, but you did finally really understand what his full compensation was.
Right, full compensation. But just the salary, you know, would say $22,000 this pay period. And then in July, he gets a 5% raise. And then in September, he gets a 12% raise. And so I'm sitting there, you know, figuring it out. And, you know.
It was very masterful planning on Rizzo's part, because he had a 3-year contract that renewed annually. So it wasn't really a 3-year contract, it was like a 1-year contract. I mean, and he had built in these massive raises. There was 1 year that he got, and 1 year he got like a 47% raise, right?
Well, like 2004, 2005, it was 47%.
He also planned these salaries.
Yeah.
He literally listed them. Here's what I'll get next year and this year and the following year after that.
And I think we wrote in that first story, this year he got an $84,000 raise, right? And the next year he gets like a $97,000 raise. And what was actually funny is, you know, we figured out 787. So the day before the story came out, I called Rizzo. He's giving me his cell phone because he's excited now for this moment. He likes us, basically because he has, I think, a 19-month-old and I have a 2.5-year-old, and he's somehow thought we wanted. So I added it up and I get this 787. I call him up and I say, listen, you said 700. I come up with 787. Tell me where my math is wrong. And he says, you know, I think you're a little high, you know, maybe $20,000, $30,000. And well, show me how, it doesn't matter. And I tell Ruben, right? I told Ruben this, and Ruben, we're trying to figure it out. And I said, you know, Ruben, we'll go with my figure. If it's wrong, I'm willing to do a correction. It says, Bob Rizzo did not make 787. He actually made 750. But pretty much, you know, one of the most interesting things about this story, because then it just sort of like took off, and it is, I think, for a variety of reasons, it's really struck a chord with people.
And that's really interesting, is to sort of understand why it took off. When we had the story done, our managing editor, Deva Maharaj, became just obsessed with it. If you recall, the day the story came out, it was the main story on the front page with this graphic that basically took up half the page showing his salary going up over the years, and with this headline, how much is the city manager worth? And that really, I think, began to sort of make people talking about it. And for a variety of reasons, it just sort of took on. It was during the summer. There wasn't a lot going on in the world. It was a story, you know, about, you know, government, you know, out of control, which a lot of people are feeling with the economy, and with a lot of people feeling about government. And what was really good, though, is that Jeff and Ruben and Kim Christensen and some of our other reporters who went onto this team quickly realized that really the story was partly about his salary, but the larger story was really about the way the salary was being given in a city that is incredibly poor, where there's very few people who participate in democracy, and where this city had a very high tax rate. And really, they were taxing their residents very high, and a lot of that was going into personal enrichment of the top city officials in the city. And I think that that's really kind of where it began to hit more of a chord in the follows that we did the next few weeks, where it really wasn't just a one-hit outrage about a city manager who makes a lot of money, but it sort of told a more kind of systemic story about a place where the city government sort of really taxes its citizens to a very high level and then compensates its top officials very well. And it was one of those things that it just sort of took off, and Jeff and Ruben have probably been interviewed many, many times since then, and continue to write stories every day, pretty much.
But I'm talking about the way it took off. When this thing hit, and like I said, there was a story about this 2005 special election they had that enabled them to get around state limits on how much city councils get paid, which was never talked about when they tried to get this passed. But it was, at the beginning, it was so out of control. The number of emails that I think both of us got literally was unmanageable.
I think I remember at 5 in the morning I started getting them.
It was just literally unmanageable. You know, tips for Bell, tips for other cities. Congratulations, this is why we buy the LA Times. This is what journalism should be doing, which I totally agree with that. And it was just astonishing that the numbers of emails, you almost couldn't get any work done. And then, I'll never forget the first city council meeting. Ruben was covering it, and I'm in the office, you know, trying to get the hell out and go home. And Ruben calls in. There are just hundreds of people here. So I went down there, and Ruben's inside. There are 96 people inside. It fits 96 people. So Ruben's in there. And it was amazing from videos we had done, these people knew who we were. You're walking through, and they're like patting us on the back. I mean, literally, it's like they saw me, and it's like they hugged me. It's unbelievable. It was so incredibly rewarding. You know, people asking for your autograph. There was then the meeting where Ruben was there, and they had cut their salaries by 90%. People were hugging and kissing him. You know, it was just, there was a bar across the street we went to. Why don't you tell the story about going to the bar?
I tried to go down there, but it was too late by the time I got there.
You wanted some of it.
I think it was after we had covered that. Was it the first one?
The
The
first
first
meeting.
council meeting. We went. We were supposed to meet someone for a story in one of our sources. And so we went to this bar. We walk in, and you know, usually when you're at a bar, especially when it's dark, the door opens, there's bright lights, everyone just looks at you, and they just go back to doing what they're doing. But in this case, when we opened the door, it's like everyone's paused and looked at us, and they just got off their stools and walked to us and shook our hands, and they just, the round's on me, the round's on me.
Well, I mean, what you guys are talking about has been interesting because we started getting so many tips. I mean, literally tips about Bell, tips about Maywood, tips about like cities everywhere. Yeah, exactly. City managers, and we have now put maybe 6 to 8 reporters or more on this story, and not just on Bell, but on the neighboring cities. We filed public requests with all the neighboring cities. We've probably got 4 different editors or 5 different editors, you know, who have worked on the story, and it's just kind of ballooned into us taking a closer look at all these neighboring cities. We ended up we had 2 of our really great interns help us on a city manager compensation survey. So we got city managers for all the cities in California, for all the cities in LA County. And we've seen some of the neighboring papers do similar surveys in San Diego. And I have seen newspapers all over the country asking their, you know, with residents asking, what does your city manager make? What does your city council make? And that has been, you know, one of the really gratifying things too. It's just kind of really opened up the books. I think the city of LA is now publishing or posting on their website every single employee's salary. So we've seen a lot of sunshine on salaries, and I think it's all because of Bell.
What about the guys on the council? How did they get up to 100,000? And what was it? What was it with the guy who got 8,000? I mean, what's his IQ?
The funny thing about the guy who makes $8 grand, when we found out, our eyes were kind of, what? So I called the DA, who's looking at these high salaries, and I said, did you know this guy makes $8 grand? He goes, I'd be pissed off.
But they basically were getting a salary for city council, and then they enriched themselves by creating special salaries for each of the boards that they sat on. So planning, commission, redevelopment, and that's how they got to 100,000.
But how did the other guy not know? I mean, why?
Well, we've been asking that question over and over. Not just about them, but about him, but about all of them.
Yeah, we have suspicions, but we don't know yet. Yeah.
They voted
Now,
on
were they being, the city council people basically being paid off to keep their mouths shut?
That's an interesting question. I mean, is the narrative either, the city council were on the take along with Rizzo somehow, or were they just like the dumbest human beings in the history of the world being led around by their nose? That's an interesting question. I don't think we've quite sorted it out yet.
We do know that top managers around Rizzo were paid handsomely.
Yes,
we also know that the benefits that were offered to city employees were great. I mean, I would want to go work there right now. They did like tuition reimbursement. They gave loans to employees. They were very, very generous with their compensation packages, both with vacation time, sick time. They had a very generous pension program, and on top of pension, they had a supplemental retirement plan. So, whether that was all by Rizzo's design or what.
And we've written about they were getting loans from the city, which was clearly illegal.
Where's a podunk little town like Bell? I mean, I grew up here when I was going to Belmont High, and Bell used to be the poor man's school. I mean, where'd they get the money to pay themselves?
Well, looking at their budget, we see that they were racking up a lot of taxes. Business taxes were skyrocketing. Property taxes, which we've written about.
The second highest property taxes in the county.
And they've now been ordered to roll back property taxes and refund money. Yeah.
Were the people ever protesting?
No.
I think we get the impression that after we wrote that story, there's this just river of anger just now finally coming out that's sort of been, I don't think they've been able to let this anger out, and we're seeing that at all these council meetings. They're just angry because this is something that the residents have complained about for years. No one has.
Yeah.
Right, they had suspicions, our council members are making this much, or the city manager is making this much, and they're using money to purchase these properties. They're misusing funds, and it seems like no one was listening to them. And now that, we allowed them to speak out with these stories, it's just like anger after this
and
frustration.
the paperwork is hard to decipher. I mean, even for us. And in some cases, it's unclear whether the city was completely forthcoming with information they were providing to residents. The minutes are minimal, the agendas are minimal, so it would be difficult to make things out.
In all of your interviews, shame whereas thy blush, has anybody ever expressed any, this is greed on such a gargantuan scale, somebody must have expressed guilt or repentance or shame or...
I think we have one council member who's a pastor. Councilman
The one who said he thought the money came as a miracle from God.
And the one who's not living
I was thinking,
in
the miracle from God is you saying that first.
So no, there's been no...
One council member.
That's it.
They seem a little, you guys, the first meeting after this whole thing ran, I remember, I wasn't there, but I remember watching it on the news. The KTLA had tried to chase down the mayor. They all came to their city council meeting wearing like Hawaiian shirts, and they were like totally casual, completely unprepared for what was about to hit them. And I noticed that on the next meeting, they were all in suits. So somebody had told them, you know, you guys need to be more professional. But you've come back from meetings and said, and you have, saying you thought they were really tone deaf,
Yes.
that they didn't have any clue.
Yeah, and you know, your question about the outrage or lack of outrage in some ways speaks to the role of newspapers and the press in covering these things. You know, a lot of these places don't really have local papers and no one's looking into them, and that probably in some ways made a difference. We were lucky, you know, we have one reporter now who covers all of Southeast LA. We used to have a whole bureau of like 8 people who covered Southeast LA. It's now just Ruben, and we're lucky that he was there and was paying attention when all this was happening. And you really do see a difference. I mean, there's an interesting good thing going on in Compton now, where the local paper there, this small weekly, has been really aggressively covering Compton and really looking into some interesting allegations, and the city's kind of been probably trying to retaliate against them, and we're actually looking into a story about that now. But there are places where you do have a kind of an aggressive press that does go out and dig into things. I think that this was an area, and has been written about quite often, not just by the Times, but by other papers, that you know, it's a place where there's very little you know, public participation. You know, the number of people who vote in elections, as Jeff wrote and Ruben wrote in one of their stories, only 500 people voted in the election that created a charter there which allowed them to give these high salaries to the council members. And so I think there's a lot of that. I think there are both the Times and other papers, the LA Weekly, have periodically written very aggressively about these cities in Southeast LA. Rich Morosi, you know, is kind of a hero in Southgate a few years ago. He started doing things with a guy named, I think his name was Jeffrey Anderson at the LA Weekly, who's done a lot of really interesting stories about Cudahy, which is another city down there. But you know, there isn't really a local press that really does that anymore. I think there used to be a daily newspaper there, but not for a long time. And that is sort of part of it. And you know, I think it does go in some ways to really, you have these council meetings where no one goes to them, and very few people pay attention. And there's a lot of evidence that the city council wasn't really paying attention to what was going on. It makes a big difference. And you know, I think that that's hopefully one of the lessons in it.
Could we get some student? Could we get some?
Geneva, could I come in here? I've had my hand up for quite a while.
Okay, may I say one thing?
Yeah.
I'll be glad to get your point, but we have a wonderful student turnout here, and I would really hope that the next few questions could come from them. Thank you. Go ahead.
I wonder if you could sort of step back a bit, because and say something about what you see, how you see this crisis, what you see this situation saying about the contemporary American city, and you know, the fact that it strikes me that it took a long. This is a massive, massive thing. It was going on a long time before you guys reported it. And were there no whistleblowers, or you said that there were people were ringing up and saying that they weren't happy with what was going on? That it seems there are a number of disconnects here. People disconnecting from their city government, the city government news being disconnected from the newspaper. What do you think it says about American cities that this?
You know, well, I think one thing it says is the lack of participation by people in the government. You know, before this happened, there were 4 people, right, would show up to a council meeting, something like that. You know, if a council falls in the middle of the forest and no one hears it, does the council exist? And so, I think that's part of it.
The demographics of Bell.
Yeah, Bell is 90% Latino, 50% foreign born. You know, people are
mostly uneducated, barely have high school diplomas.
Trying to make a living.
So sort of the makeup of that particular city made it ripe for this kind of thing. This likely wouldn't happen in another city that either is more educated or at least that we cover more aggressively. I mean, we did uncover it, which is great, but we also didn't uncover it for years.
Now,
Why do you think that the discovery didn't happen earlier? Were the tips coming in from Spanish language, or what was?
I think we're talking about the tips that have come since then.
let me give you an example of things that happened. I think it's pretty clear that Rizzo was covering things up. Okay, one of the things we had heard from people, Ruben and I, was we had asked Rizzo's salary We filed public records requests, and they blew us off, took too much time, didn't answer it, said this didn't fulfill what you need to do. Okay, that could have been a bunch of crap, I don't know, we haven't seen this. Okay, so we come along, and like, A, we know how to fill these things out, and government should actually be helping people doing that, it's open government. And B, if you guys don't give us our stuff, we're going to sue you, and we'll sue you just for fun. You know, that's part of it, and so that's also one of the reasons why people say, oh, bloggers can, you know, come in and take the place of newspapers. Well, look, we're a large institution which can sue people. That's an example. We have evidence that they were lying.
Right. They were completely blowing off residents. They did not fill public records requests. They were just almost completely.
I think we're also starting to see, because we requested public records of all public records that have been requested through, I can't remember the time period that we asked for, but we clearly see people asking, you want to know the salaries for the council, and they would literally type up the number. They would just type up this number that clearly was not an official document from the city saying this is how much your council member makes.
Or they would give, you know, council only payment versus.
No, but what's interesting is that one document they don't even do. For example, if you go to Bell and you say, how much does the city council get paid? Well, the truth is the city council members get paid $150 a month for the city council. It's true. So, you know, if you're not sophisticated enough, they give you $150. Well, but that's actually not what they get paid. We have a document which shows they're getting paid. It shows $675 a month. Where do they get that number? There's nothing that we can figure out. Where, I mean, if it would said 150, we would have understood that. I mean, but it just indicates sort of a wholesale.
And it also kind of speaks to the whole issue of public records. You know, there's a great debate in journalism today about who is going to tell the news of these local communities. A lot of newspapers have gone under. A lot of big newspapers like us have reduced the amount of coverage they do of local things. But there's a whole debate about who's going to cover these areas, who's going to be the watchdog, and a lot of that I think ends up being about the level of transparency that a government has. There are some government agencies in LA County that put every single thing online, and there are a lot of reporters who can really tell stories, in their living room, in their bedroom, just going through documents, studying them. There's a great blogger who runs this blog called Curbed LA, who gets a ton, LA City puts tons of their planning documents online, and she gets great stories just by kind of going through them. Bell's a place that has almost no documents online, and I think that that's going to be one of the things that hopefully in the future we'll see is that pressure can be put on governments to just be transparent. Then it'll be much easier for whether you're a blogger, a community blogger, or an activist, or a journalist to be able to see it. But if there are a lot of places like Bell, and if you look at all the kind of the websites, a lot of these cities in Southeast LA, they're all like these circa 1997 websites that have almost nothing on them, and you can almost tell that's a sign of that. I think that really, in the case of Robert Rizzo, I think it's clear he was trying to prevent people from knowing what was going on in the city. And I think when you look at places that have a lot of transparency, governments, and what they put out there, even people who are not professional journalists can access this and do good stories. In this case, because of the amount of resistance, and not just Bell, but its surrounding cities were putting out, it did take the work of 12 reporters, an attorney who's constantly was trying to sue people in order to get this stuff. If this stuff were more readily available, it wouldn't require that, and I think the bar would be lower for who could go after that information and get it.
But then why did they give us the information? Maybe because we didn't ask what's his salary. Our request was we want to see his contract. So if they hadn't given us if they had given us a forged contract, so now we would have found out, they would have been in pretty, I think, trouble then.
Right, but this is, also to answer your question, this is also kind of classic journalism, which is, and just the way our society works. I think that if you're unhappy with something, you may or may not complain. You may complain to your friends, you may complain to your neighbor, but you may not actually pick up a phone and do something about it. And I think that the minute that our stories started running, people suddenly realized that there was a place for them to go. And so they did start picking up the phone. And it's kind of the way good beat reporting works, which is, when people see movement or action, they become more, responsive. And we've seen, they've started doing marches. It's really sort of motivated the entire community in that area, I think.
That's cool. There's a question back here.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you have any news on potential resignations, and for the elected officials in this story, are these people up for re-election in November?
I believe 2 are up for re-election, but they are not running. They're ending their terms without pay. And I know currently a group that actually evolved out of all this, VASTA, which stands for Bail Association to Stop the Abuse. They are pushing forward with a recall, which I think now they're at the stage of collecting signatures, so they're very close to that. And that should be interesting to see whether they're going to recall 4 of these council members. Because one of them, obviously, the one that wasn't getting paid a handsome salary.
It's the hero.
He's right now the hero.
But Rizzo, but the top 3, the police chief, the city manager, and the assistant city manager all resigned. And it's unclear to us whether there are going to be additional pay cuts of other top administrators.
How do you see this story changing the role of reporting in these stories? And let me explain a little bit. There was a story over the weekend about a school board association, and it was a state school board association, which was funded by contributions from local school boards throughout the state, where their executive director was making compensation of 1.2 million or something to that effect. So what's the role in terms of governments now adjusting, like the city council minutes when they say, oh, we're only getting paid $150 as a council member, the adjustments that government and these officials make to kind of cover their tracks more, it seems like this might, this coverage is going to obviously have an effect because all of these people that are going to continue this are going to be looking to cover their tracks. Maybe you can elaborate on how you think this changes kind of coverage and keeping track for the next story.
Well, I think as a result of this story, and I think Kimi touched on this, is that every editor and every podunk paper around the country has probably told his reporters, I want you to go get the salaries. That's just easy. And the reporting we've done, most of it isn't particularly tricky. We're not using spreadsheets, and we're not, multimedia. So this is sort of basic, ordinary, boring reporting.
We're also likely to see a lot of legislation come out of this. We're already starting to see some suggestions that they want to, put additional checks on salary. The state controller, John Chang, also announced shortly after this, and he's auditing the city's books. He announced that I think by the end of the year or something, every city will be required to post council salaries and city manager salaries, I think. So
There's a bill to cap pensions right now, too.
right, because these guys will end up getting, $600,000, $700,000. Rizzo will get $600,000 or $700,000 in pension alone, unless they find some way to limit it.
Yeah.
Yes.
To expand a little bit, I was sort of wondering about what you see the effects of this going forward. First of all, in the community, whether you think the empowerment is something that's going to continue or sort of fade away. And in the newsroom, whether this has changed the way you plan to cover and report these stories or to present them to the public once you've reported them.
Well, I think that we'll have to see on what happens in Bell. About 8 years ago, there was a similar, in some ways, well, actually, somewhat worse scandal in Southgate, which is south of there, that our reporter Rich Morosi wrote a lot about. That ushered in a new council. The bad actors were charged, and by most accounts, that place is running very well now. They haven't really had any complaints of corruption in the last few years. We'll see. These cities, as we've reported, and as many people have reported, they have a tendency to breed corruption. They're places where there's very transitory population, transient population, and places where every few years there is some sort of a scandal. We'll see. In terms of the paper, definitely it sort of focused us more on trying to dig into these things and sort of see. As I said though, ultimately a lot of it really depends on how we can get information, and sort of we were very lucky that we got a lot of tips after this, but we'll see if, after people get sick of the story, whether, how things go.
I mean, the flip side, and maybe Shelby can talk about this a little more, is Vernon, which I think a few years ago we had reported a city manager there was making, I don't know, how much was he making? 500,000. Only records that we just got showed that he was actually making 900,000. There was a big outcry about it when we found out about this several years ago, but when we did a new public records request a few weeks ago, we found out that they were up to their old tricks again, and their city manager was making more than 400,000, right? Or nearly
For a city of 90 people, right?
90 people, and the city attorney was pulling in like more than $1 million. And, they were just in the news a couple years ago. The other side of that city though is they don't have a lot of residents. They have like 95 residents, and they keep new residents coming in, I think. So
they want to find out something.
So that obviously that scandal didn't affect them in ways that would keep them from lining their pocketbooks. So.
Yes.
I have two questions. One is, so why, on the Vernon salaries, why didn't the LA Times follow up with that? I mean, how did that last?
The city manager was indicted, the mayor was indicted, they were both charged, and the city manager would have gone to jail or prison were it not for the fact that he was 80 years old. And, that's a very good question. Why didn't, I think this really goes to staffing.
Yeah, I think it speaks in some ways to the fact that generally papers as the business model has sort of exploded. There are fewer places. As I said, I think at this area at Huntington Park, was it the Signal or something? There used to be a daily paper that kind of covered this area. It went out of business. There used to be local papers that did. The Times had a twice weekly edition. They had like 8 reporters that covered this area. That, as sort of the advertising shrank and the pages shrank, disappeared. And so I think that's a legitimate question: is who should be looking at this stuff? As I said, Vernon's a little bit unique because it doesn't really have any residents, but I do think that that's a good question, and it sort of talks to what we were talking about before, which is ultimately, who is going to step in and do this, and particularly in cities where the government really has an interest in not letting people know. It's funny when some of our reporters began to put out all the requests in all 88 cities for salaries. We predicted beforehand which 10 cities would be the last to produce it. It turned out to be exactly right. Vernon, Compton, Inglewood, Baldwin Park, San Fernando, and they ended up having the highest salaries, and they were the very last to report, only after being threatened multiple times to sue. We probably got 60 of the requests back within a day. Some people were calling saying, "What took you so long?" We actually had 2 cities that just sent them to us themselves because they wanted us to know, and it sort of speaks to the different sort of expectations of public participation that different cities have, different expectation of what would happen if someone found out how much you made, and that's an unfortunate thing because in a way it sort of depends on the populace. And I think a good example of this is it doesn't take a big paper like the Times to do this. There was a scandal last year in Temple City, a development scandal in which I believe 2 council members were charged, and it was the San Gabriel Valley Tribune, which is a small paper, and they just found out about it, and they kept writing about it and writing about it and writing about it, and it suddenly became the big issue of the city. Those council members were defeated, they ended up being indicted, but when there's no one to write about this, when there's no one to pay attention, I could easily see that Temple City scandal being, again, another scandal that just sort of no one knew about until it was too late.
Which points back to the importance of what you said previously about campaigns to really enforce sunshine laws, to get stronger ones, to bring, we have things like the Sunlight Foundation, whose effort it is to bring public records to attention, but then you have to have citizens who seek them. And, Other questions? Yes,
I have a question. I haven't kept up on it, but what's going on with the bond issuance? That wasn't it 30 million or so that they requested and then never spent? And I'm curious about Vernon. If they only have 95 residents, did they issue a bond and that's how they had the money to pay themselves?
They can speak for the bill. I think Vernon is an unusual city. I think they get a lot of their money from a power plant they own, and the power they provide power to all the industrial plants that are in the city. So I think it's a little unique.
The bond bond, the $35 million bond that was issued to purchase some railroad property comes due in November, and they haven't indicated exactly how they're going to pay it. So they've been in some pretty significant upheaval, and their conversations with the bondholder are basically, we need some time to sort this out because our city's a mess. So it's very up in the air. We also are looking into a $70 million bond that was issued for parks. And there's a reporter that's specifically working on that. We're trying to see what they've done with the money, you know, how they've spent it, and if there's anything to show for it. But this has been one of the big problems, is understanding their budget, because they move money around and it's unclear what's funding certain things.
Well, one of the things that's been the most amazing part of this story is we'll go out, and Ruben and I have had this experience like almost every day. We'll go out and report a story, write a story. We come back with 3 more stories. I mean, this continues to happen. I mean, still, I mean, you go out to a story and you talk to people and you're writing some, and it's hard to stay focused on this one story you're doing because all of a sudden they tell you about this, and they tell you about this, and they give you a document that shows this, and that's, you know.
As hard as I called you for some tips.
It's been amazing. It just keeps on.
Oh, I was just wondering if you've been able to talk to employees that are lower down on the ladder and see what kind of comments they had after this work?
We have not. In fact, I think they kept us incognito.
Yeah, they have.
I mean, you guys have sources who work within the city.
Right, but they have continued to do a good job of, you know, not allowing people to talk to us. I mean, there's a person we want to talk to who's the head of, what's his title? Director of Administrative Services, something like that. I mean, this is a woman who makes, you know, over 400 grand, which is too much money. That's more than city managers make in most cities. Who, you know, she's running the financial stuff, so she's the one who knew all this stuff, and we would like to talk to her, and, you know, have had no luck. So.
I actually saw them at there was a city council meeting, which they had already passed over before, and they back property taxes, photocopying, this other bunch of stuff. And I saw them, and for the first time, I actually saw all the seats for all the officials actually full, along with, you know, the rest of the residents there. And I actually approached, I think it was Annette Peretz, who handles Parks and Recreation stuff. She's the Director of Community Services. And I walked up to her and I said, I want to talk to you about Parks and Recreation, because according to their budget that we've seen, they're racking up about $400,000 to $500,000 every year.
They're raising like soccer fees.
In revenue, and they're raising like soccer fees, you know, for outside residents. It would cost you $200 to put your child in this soccer room. And so I wanted to talk to her about that, and she says, I don't want to talk to you. And I said, well, can you explain to me, you know, how is it that these parks are making such big revenue? I mean, I don't understand that there's a skate park and that there's a league for soccer. I don't see how you can make so much money. And she says, I won't do a one-on-one interview with you. You have to get, you know, the city manager and the city attorney, and then I'll sit in with you. And so she was refusing to talk to me. And I guess as the others probably also didn't want to talk.
Other questions?
Was the election in 2005, how did they sell it to the residents? Because was there a motive beyond just having the freedom to enrich themselves?
Yeah, that it was sold to residents as more local control, and we will not send as many taxes to Sacramento. That's how it was sold.
Well, that's for sure.
But there were only, you know, fewer than 400 people voted in that election. But anyone who knows anything about politics knows, an off-year election, no one's going to vote. This is an off year of an off year, no one's going to vote. One thing on the ballot, you know, but they thought it was important enough to spend $40,000 to $60,000 of city money in a not affluent city to put this thing on the ballot, you know.
And plus we know now that most of those voters voted by absentee ballot, and that there are now investigations going on into voter fraud.
Right.
So, you know.
Which we've written about.
Yeah.
And we wrote, and that's what started the investigation.
Yeah.
Right.
Have you, well, this is sort of outside your beat, but have you had evidence that this story is having a great effect nationally on perceived perceptions of the role of government, straight to the Tea Party all over the country?
Well, you know, it's funny, we have gotten, Ruben and I think have gotten the same email. How come you're not saying these people are Democrats? Honestly, A, I don't know if they are. B, I didn't know corruption was a party. But, you know, I mean, I could see it feeding into that kind of mistrust of government, say they're all a bunch of crooks kind of thing. You know, we get bizarre emails too, and so we've gotten some of those. But, you know, I certainly haven't seen any evidence yet of Tea Party people, you know, specifically talking about it. Now, it wouldn't surprise me.
How thinly spread is the LA Times at this point?
I mean,
in covering local communities other than the city and county of Los Angeles?
Well, we have about, you know, our Metro staff's about 70-ish reporters and about 15 editors. We have a lot of reporters who work on, you know, projects, longer-term enterprise. That's our kind of mission, is to do that. I worked at the paper for almost 20 years, and I started right out of college. And you know, places like Southeast, where we once had 6 reporters, we have 1. You know, we used to have a Valley edition of like 20 or 30 reporters. We now have 1 reporter in the Valley. We used to have a staff of people in the West Side. We have 1 reporter in the West Side. So it sort of changes, obviously.
Orange County.
Orange County, yeah, where Jeff and I and Kimi all got our start. Was once a huge staff, and it's much less. And you know, that is. It just marks a complete change in, you know, the economic fortunes of the paper, in certain ways of the philosophy of the paper. But I think that I think we still have enough reporters to, you know, cover things well, and you know, we don't cover things as in depth and with this amount of breadth that we did before, because you can't with the fewer reporters. But I think that what we've really tried to do is make choices about what we think is important, and you know, enterprise, investigative reporting, watchdog reporting are really at the top of the list. And you know, we could have 1 extra reporter cover Southeast, but we really want to have them focus their time on, you know, things like this school teacher performance project that we're doing, and we have a bunch of other kind of high-end basically projects that are going to land in the next few months. That those things take a lot of time, a lot of work. You know, the education story took, you know, a year, more than a year to do, and there are a couple of stories that we have reporters been working on for almost 2 years, and that's a choice that the paper's made because we think that's really important. But in some ways, it does affect how much boots we have on the ground, going to council meetings, reading every blog that's out there, going to community meetings and getting a sense of that. And it's a trade-off, but I think it's the right thing to do because I think that people turn to us for that level of depth and that kind of, so we'll see. But you're right, I mean, we do miss things, and we do rely on other papers as tip sheets. We rely on a lot of blogs, like, it's like Curb LA, Neon Tommy, for stories that we are not first on, but that we kind of find out and decide what's something we want to do. And that's a trade-off, but we can't. What none of us can control is how many reporters we have. But I think that in the end, it's sort of the philosophy we have for what the LA Times should be doing.
And I think this also shows that we can still, I mean, it's not ideal, but when a story like this comes up, we've clearly demonstrated that we still have the expertise and the ability to do it. And I think the paper and Shelby have really said, okay, this is important. I mean, within like a week of the Bell story breaking, we were just like throwing reporters onto it, and now there's still lots of reporters on it.
So you guys mentioned Neon Tommy. Our students are doing a lot of journalism, as you know. Do your remarks have been full of things that are tips for all of us. I mean, good ideas. But what would each of you, just sort of in closing, is anything else occur to you that you would want to convey to young, upcoming journalists who are, digging around too?
Well, I would just say, in both of Jeff and Ruben's cases, persistence. It was not easy to get these records. We were, told at first that we couldn't get them, and it took a long time. But I think persistence is the most important thing, and standing up to people who won't give us what we want. I mean, one thing that's been true of this story from the very beginning is people constantly saying you can't have what we know we should have, public information. But you can't have this, you can't have this, we can't give this to you. And just knowing what your rights are and demanding that they comply with the law, I think is probably to me the most important thing, because there are a lot of there are a lot of intimidating people. The city of Vernon, which is the city we're focusing on now, they have a whole outside PR apparatus. You can't even get to someone in the city. You call the city, they send you to a PR operation based on the west side, and some high-priced PR person will call you back and say, oh I'm your communication level between the city and the reporter. And so just knowing what your rights are and demanding things and not taking no for an answer is, I think, but you can expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say indulge your curiosity, be skeptical, and learn to write well enough so you can tell your story, because if you can't tell your story, no one's going to read it.
For me, I would add, since you already touched on the whole persistence in trying to get public records, get to know your council members really well. Get those cell phones and, get to know everyone, because, which is what I did, what I learned from this, the whole Maywood and Bell, is that I got to know all of them, got their numbers, and then when this exploded, I think without me building those relationships, we would have just relied only on documents, and there wouldn't be that quote that you would get from that council person.
What would you do if you got 50 interns show up the door from a good journalism school? What would you do with them?
We've had two that we've put to work. I mean, these interns probably got the best, the best summer of any recent interns, in that they were put on this story, and they're the ones that have been gathering a lot of documents for us. And it's, I mean, I think a lot of what this story has been just journalism 101. Sourcing has been incredibly important. These guys have been taking calls in the middle of the night. Ruben's been up at 5 in the morning picking up documents. I mean, it's just been crazy. One night he didn't go to sleep because he was at a city council meeting till 4. So, hard work, persistence, sourcing, and I think for this story, it also just goes to show you that public records after Quest is indispensable.
It's so nice to have the eternal verities affirmed. It's just great having you. We could have done another one of these on the LAUSD value added. Phenomenal. You're having a huge impact.